welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today will be the weekend review show for August 16th through the 18th, 2019. It's a little bit later than normal. I had some visitors in town. Actually, one of the visitors was Chris, who's going to be doing our Time Machine segment here later on in the show. It's a new segment. Got a great reaction last week, so he's back for some more. Excited about that. We're going to walk through the top 10 here. We had a ton of new wide releases. I believe 6 new wide releases, or maybe 5. So we got to walk through all those really quickly, see how they did, walk through the rest of the top 10, talk a little bit about some limited stuff that's going on out there, and then Chris will take it away and I'll close out the show talking about sort of the end of the summer here and what's going to happen for the next few weeks. But let's dive into the top 10 because we have a lot to talk about. The number one film this weekend was a new wide release, Good Boys from Universal. Did $21 million for the weekend. This is way over tracking. Tracking was looking at like 12 to 14 for the weekend. This one ended up at 21, so fantastic performance for that movie. Rated R comedy about, I guess, like 3 teenage-ish or preteen. I don't even know how old they are. It reminded me of Farm Child. I didn't think it was going to do very well. I was, of course, wrong in this situation. It has done quite well. Budget was $20 million on this one. In terms of why it's doing so well, it looks like it might be because of the quality of the film. Rotten Tomatoes score right now with critics is an 80%. The actual score is a 66 out of 100. A little discrepancy there. Again, this reminded me a little bit of what was the movie last week? Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Very similar situation. Fresh score of 80 something. Actual score in the 60s. So critics liked it, but they certainly did not love it because that actual score would be in the 70s or 80s, and that's not there. So Good Boys, I think, was just good enough for a lot of critics, and they enjoyed it. But an 80% score, you can't really scoff at. A verified audience score of 89%, which is fantastic. 88 out of 100 as the actual score, which is great. All audience score from Rotten Tomatoes, 86%, 85 out of 100, very similar to that verified audience score. So people do like this rated R comedy. Cinema score of a B+, post track of an 83%, it looks like. Or I think 80% actually is what I meant to put there. Something like that in the 80s, low 80s. So it's very good. It's not like, hey, this is one of the best films I've ever seen in my life, but this is like a very enjoyable film for most people. 60% definite recommend from post track, which is pretty good. Letterboxd of a 68. So the film nerds, film vanguard aren't necessarily sold that it's amazing. But again, Letterboxd 60 is pretty good. 70 is very good. And anything 80 or above is fantastic. So it's definitely in that decent zone. Compared this Letterboxd score to other sort of comedies that were big over the last year. Night School was a 46 out of 100. Game Night was a 70, Blockers was a 64, and Tag was a 60. So it's actually on the higher end of all those, closer to that Game Night score, which is pretty high for a comedy at the 70 range on Letterboxd. So the film snobs really kind of like this film as well. So that's a very good sign. So what is this thing going to do? It's at 21 right now. I thought it was kind of a weird time to release this. Deadline thinks it was a good time to release it because people are going back to school. But is this a school movie? It's a rated R comedy. Who's the demographic here for this? Male showed up 52-48 to female there. That's actually a pretty normal breakdown within about a 1% of the average movie-going audience in terms of gender breakdown. 47% white. 25% Latino, 14% African American, 14% Asian other. Nothing really out of the ordinary there, except the Asian other is up higher. It's usually around 7 to 8%, so it's up at 14%. I can't really pinpoint why on that one. What are the prospects for this movie over the next couple of weeks? Because the audience reaction was pretty good here, and the critics tend to like this one. I think it's going to have like a 2.7 to 3x leg. So you're looking at about $60 million domestically, US and Canada. And I think that would be a really great run for something like this. It does have about, 2 weeks now of runway. There's not a ton coming out at the end of August. Again, the end of August is the gutter slot of like the box office. Nothing is happening these last 2 weeks. It's a little bit like January. There's just maybe April you can compare it to some degree. There's just not a lot happening because we're in a huge cultural transition moment in the United States and Canada. This is when all the kids are going back to school, and we're talking grade school little kids all the way up to college. They're all going back right now. And because of that, a lot of parents were on vacation or took vacation in August, and now they're coming back to their work. So now we're sort of making this transition from summer into autumn. And it tends to be a huge lull at the box office for these 2 to 3 weeks. It was so bad, I think, 2 years ago, the box office crash of August 2017, it was a disaster. Like nothing came out and nobody went. I think they're like $800 million was lost essentially from what the norm was over like a 6-week period. That's not going to happen this year just because there's so much coming out. But I just underscore the fact that this is a very quiet time at the box office. So Good Boys hitting 21 is a really good number. I do think it's going to have a decent multiplier, at least 2.5x up to 3x, maybe even higher if word of mouth really catches on. That verified audience score of 89% is really high for something, for a movie like this that doesn't have a built-in fan base, that's original IP and a brand new property. That's fantastic. And so I think Universal is going to be very happy with this. And Seth Rogen, who I believe, executive produced this? Did he direct it? I don't even know. But a great performance for Good Boys. I expect probably about a 50% drop next weekend. It all really depends on when people are going back to school and going back to work. But I think a 50% drop makes sense for that. Number 2 this weekend was Fast and the Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw. This is in its 3rd weekend with a 44% drop, which is pretty good actually. $14.1 million for the weekend. Lost about 590 theaters. Per theater average right now is at $37, almost $3,800 per theater. It sits at 133 now domestically, but again, as I've sort of noted with this film, this is not a domestic film. This is an international film. It'll probably make only about 20% of its total take here in the US and Canada, and the rest will be overseas or in foreign territories. So it's only made 133 here domestically, but throughout the world it has made $437 million. So that you can already see that it's a completely different story outside the US and Canada. So with this one, it's going to be a really hard read. $200 million production budget. I forget what the marketing budget was, but I think they quoted it at like 160 or something. It's insanely high. It doesn't make any sense why you would put that type of money marketing wise and production budget behind a movie like this, just because it's an August release. Everybody knows that August releases are just depressed compared to the other summer months of July, June, and May. There's just not as much oomph in August. And then on top of that, this is not a mainline story. This is a side story in the Fast and the Furious series. A series, by the way, is kind of running out of steam to some degree. So it's kind of questionable why Universal decided to go all in on this movie with that massive marketing and production budget. At 437 right now, worldwide. I think the number was $600 million. Is that the one number that Deadline was throwing around from their inside sources of break even for this? I guess it'll make that. But I think this is kind of a push movie. This is not going to be a $300 million profit movie or a $200 million profit movie. That's not going to happen. That is not in the cards here. I think Universal is just going to be happy to sort of break even and make a little bit of a profit here. And you take a step back and it's like, I think the goal probably was $100 million or $200 million in profit. Why did you spend so much money to make that almost impossible? So that would be the big question that would be going around about that one. But I think the performance here domestically is kind of lower than I expected. I expected this thing to open up at 80, 70, 80, close out at about 200, maybe 220-ish, 240-ish, something like that. Maybe I was a little bit too bullish on that, but it's not going to come anywhere near that. And it's going to run into it in a couple of weeks. It's going to take up a lot of its audience. So yeah, I'm not sure domestically if this is going to be a win. And I think worldwide, it's also questionable about whether it's actually going to make a profit or not. So I think right now we just have to call it a push. Ty Goes to the Runner maybe for a single. I'm not sure. But it's doing okay, I would say. So that's number 2. Number 3 is Lion King, which is doing fantastic. 11.9 million this weekend. A great 41% drop. It is starting to lose theaters. Lost 660 theaters. Per theater average is at $3,300 per theater. Total take so far is just shy of $500 million. $500 million here domestically. Internationally, it is at $1.4 billion. So again, like I said last week, this movie's printing money. Disney's certainly happy with it, but I note that like people have not responded well to this movie. I don't think it's a good movie. And a lot of the reaction from critics, especially top critics who've been doing this for a long time, they hated the movie. So I do think it's going to shift the strategy at Disney a bit. Again, they're going to make a ton of cash, but I think it will affect future live action or computer remakes. They're going to have to be a little bit more spicy, I guess is the term. They have to have a little bit something new, something unique about it, because this just felt like a carbon copy. Like you just took the original and put it into a computer and changed the animation and added new voices. And that's not enough to make a great film. And so I think, it's kind of a not necessarily a mixed bag at all financially. Financially, it's a grand slam, but I think creatively and long-term brand-wise, it's a little bit of a mixed bag for Lion King. In any event, it is doing quite well. Number 4 this weekend was Angry Birds 2. This one actually opened up during the week. I totally forgot that happened. $10.5 million for this weekend. Per theater average, not great at $2,700. Total take so far for Angry Birds is at $16.2 million. This one's not a great opening. It's not, if we compare it to the original opened up at 38 back in May 2016 and closed that at 107. This is not going to come anywhere close to that. It's at what now? 16 now for the weekend and some change. So not even half of what the original did with a few extra days. So where does this one go? I don't know. It's at 10.5 for the week and you expect at least 30. It's really going to struggle, I think. It's a children's film, so it's going to have a good multiplier. Maybe it ends around 40, maybe a couple $1 million over the opening weekend of the original. This is just a mistake. I have no idea who greenlit this movie. It's from Sony. I don't know if I don't have any production budget information. I do. It's $65 million. That's insane. Why are you spending $65 million to make a sequel to Angry Birds movie? It doesn't make any sense. And why are you releasing it here at the doldrums at the end of summer? This is a dumping ground, right? So the stuff doesn't add up. It feels like it's getting buried. It feels like they just did it. Someone sold somebody on the idea, got everybody involved again. But this is going nowhere, and it's not going to make any money. This is 100% going to be a loss. Maybe there's a huge market for this overseas. Did the original one have a big market overseas? I have to double check that. Okay, it did. So maybe they're thinking, Russia, Brazil, wherever, India, like this is going to play pretty well. I mean, it is like what was like the world's most popular smartphone game for a long time. So the last breakdown was 30% domestic, 70% foreign on the original. So maybe that's the expectation here, is that it kind of does the same thing. So maybe it does break even. But I think if you're looking just at domestic numbers, it's a huge flop and kind of a disaster on some level. But that is Angry Birds 2 coming at number 4. Number 5 was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark in its second weekend. A good drop for a horror movie, 52%. Per theater average was $3,200. Total gross right now is $40 million here domestically. This one on a lower budget, $25 million bucks. Internationally, it's only at 14, so it doesn't look like it's opened to a ton of places yet. So it's in at $54 million worldwide right now. I think the story on that one, it's a win. CBS Films is going away. This is their second to last release ever. I think they have one more coming out in October. The expectation here was below this. It's sitting at $40 million right now domestically. You can bet it's probably going to, get its way to 60. It opened up at 20 last weekend. So I think that's a win for CBS Films. I think I saw this movie. I thought it was pretty decent for what it was. And as someone who grew up with the books, I thought it was an interesting take on the story, or the stories, I should say, the group of stories. The only thing that felt a little bit off to me was like, I think the biggest thing that felt to me was, why is this a period piece for like 1968? That didn't make no sense to me whatsoever. And it brought in all this stuff about Vietnam and Nixon and the election. And I was like, this is just bizarre. And I'm someone who's a politico and a political nerd. I know all about the 1960 election. I'm also like a Vietnam War nerd. So you would think I would be like really into this, but it just seemed like very strange and off to me. Like, why are you doing a period piece? It's almost like it's easier to tell a story in the past than it is in the present for some reason. I think Stranger Fiction has really sort of pulled people in that sort of like somewhat recent last 50 years history of like telling stories that way. I just don't think it works at all for scary stories to tell in the dark. I thought it would have been much better if it was a modern day version of that. But whatever, it's doing quite well for the penultimate CBS Films release. Actually, Lionsgate distributed this, but I think CBS Films was the producer. Okay, so that's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Number 6 was 47 Meters Down, a brand new wide release. I guess it's 47 Meters Down 2 or 47 Meters Down Uncaged. Actually saw this today with the one and only Chris, who will be coming up here in his new Time Machine segment. We both hated this movie. It was terrible. We had actually watched the first one to prep ourselves for the second one. The first one, you know what? Not that bad. Pretty well done for what it was. Matthew Modine hams it up. Mandy Moore's great. It's just your standard genre film, but a very well done genre film. 47 Meters Down Uncaged is kind of a mess, to be honest with you. It's not very good. I don't know what they were thinking. It's the same director. Obviously, they're trying to cash in a bit on the success of the first one. Keep in mind, the first one was VOD. Literally, they had the DVDs printed and they stopped the trucks from going to sell the DVDs and say, no, we're going to put this out in the theaters. It's insane. It's a nuts story. And then it goes on to make, $40-something million at the box office. I mean, huge success for what it was. This one, not so much. Rotten Tomatoes score right now sits at 50, 49 out of 100, which is terrible. Verified audience score, which we contributed to, me and Chris, 68%. I think we gave it a 40 out of 100. 68%, 75 out of 100 actual score, which seems pretty high to me for what I saw on screen. All audience, 63%, 71 out of 100 is the actual score. Also seems very high to me for what I saw on the screen. Cinema score of a C+, that seems a little bit more accurate. Post track of 50, that seems pretty darn accurate. Letterboxd score also of a 50. Compare that Letterboxd score to 47 Meters Down, the original, exactly the same, 50. Crawl, a recent creature feature this year, with 62. The Meg had a 50, so right in line with this, and The Shallows had 60, which I think is one of the better recent shark movies, The Shallows with Blake Lively. So this one, it's just not a good movie. I can see how they pushed it out here in August. The original, I think, was pushed out in August too, but it did so well. Female showed up here 53 to 47. That's surprising to me. So with these sort of Jaws-y shark movies, I think the expectation is that you're going to see some gore, you're going to see some like old school, good old special effects, blood in the water stuff. That seems a little bit more of a male draw to me. So the fact that this is actually over-indexing on females, I guess maybe because all the main characters are females and sort of there's some female empowerment going on with, people survive and stuff like that. So like the original. So maybe that's the draw here. Obviously, the trailer promoted this female protagonist in it. So that might be why. But I think one of the reasons why it's underperforming is men did not show up as much as they would normally do for a movie like this. 47% white was the audience, 25% Latino, 15% African American, 13% Asian. You're over-indexing there on a little bit on Latinos, a little bit on African Americans, and a lot on the Asian other category. What's the story in this one? Where is it going? $9 million for the weekend, 2,800 theaters, so per theater average was just about $3,100. Maybe there's some international audience for this. I guess there would be. I think Entertainment Studios, the release distributor, is German, I believe. So they're probably going to push this out all over the world. But it just seems kind of like a loss. But production budget was $12 million. I don't know. I don't know what the play was here. I get that you wanted to do a sequel to the original, but here's how you got to do this. The original was a decent movie. Sure, it was shot for not a lot of bucks. Sure, it was a genre schlocky movie, but they did well with that concept. With something like this, you had a couple routes that you can go. You could go the uber arty route, which I think is kind of a big bet, and make it like high art with really good cinematography. Get a new director. Just use the 47 Meters Down name to do another sort of shark film that had a lot of meat on the bones. Or you go super schlocky, like Piranhas 3D in 2010, which I think was very successful for what it was. You just recognize, hey, people are going to see this for a lot of fun, kind of like the Meg. Let's have a good time. Let's show them gore. Let's show them over the top stuff. Let's keep them engaged, entertained. This tried to like walk this weird middle ground where it was schlocky and then tried to be a little bit arty at the same time. It just did not work at all. I don't see this going anywhere. I think it's going to have a massive drop next weekend too. But yeah, so that 47 meters down on Cage, 47 meters down 2, if you will. Number 7 was Dora and the Lost City. 8.5 million, 51% on 51% drop. Didn't lose any theaters. It's still in that 2-week sort of grace period with the exhibitors. Per theater average is $2,300. Total take so far is essentially $34 million domestically. Internationally, we're looking at 44. This one kind of feels like a flop too. It's going to struggle to break even. Maybe there's a huge home entertainment audience for this, but I just don't see it. I think I see it as kind of a little bit of a loss right now for Paramount. That was number 7. Number 8 was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Still chugging along. 34% drop this weekend. 7.6 million in its 4th weekend. It did lose 1,000 theaters though, so it's starting its gradual descent out of the theaters. Per theater average was 3,000, which is, I think, pretty healthy for a 4th weekend. Total take so far here domestically in the US and Canada, $114 million. Worldwide, it has started to trickle open in foreign markets, $7 million so far. So worldwide total of 122. This is a great performance for Tarantino. Now, if the costs were a lot lower, it'd be making a lot of money. I don't know how much money it's going to make now with a $90 million and I think $120 million worldwide marketing budget, if my memory serves me correctly. I think they'll find a way to make money with this. It just, why would you, again, kind of like the Fast and the Furious thing, but on a totally different level with Sony here. Like, why are you pushing a $90 million production budget? You got Brad Pitt, you got Leonardo DiCaprio. I know they're expensive. But then you give Quentin Tarantino a lot of money to make this movie. And then you do a kind of strong arm marketing campaign. I don't know. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think maybe it will play out here well for them and they'll make a good profit. But it almost seems like they're just trying to break even with the big marketing campaign. And it's like the more they spend, this kind of more they have to spend, if that makes sense, to get this thing to work. I think just outside the production and marketing budget context, it's a huge success for Quentin Tarantino. Breaking the $100 million mark here already in its 4th weekend is fantastic. But in that financial context, it's a lot murkier about how well this thing is actually going to do. But for right now, it's doing pretty well. We won't know until much later whether it actually broke even or not, if we ever really know. But we will have a good idea, ballpark, later, probably next year. That was number 8. Number 9 was Blinded by the Light, a brand new wide release opener from Warner Brothers. 4.4 million, 2,300 theaters. That's bad. Per theater average $1,900. Yikes. What did I say about this? I said it had a chance to break out, but I thought yesterday was going to steal its thunder, and that's exactly what's happened. And if you look at the numbers here, Rotten Tomatoes score, 90% from critics, 75 out of 100. Fantastic score. Verified audience score, even better, 93%, and a 91 out of 100 actual score from people who bought tickets on Fandango. These scores are outrageously good. All audience score 90%, real score 89 out of 100, cinema score of an A-, post-track of a 90. So this Blinded by the Light is objectively a fantastic movie. Critics love it, audiences love it. It's that simple. Letterboxd 70, higher than yesterday, and yesterday is pretty beloved by general audiences. That had 64. This is at 70. It's too bad. This is a too bad situation. It's a great film. It seems really marketable. You have the music of Bruce Springsteen playing center stage. Who doesn't love Bruce Springsteen in the US and Canada? We all love him. So it seemed poised for success. I think what ended up happening here is it got a really bad release slot here in the slow part of August. And then it got blindsided, pun intended, always by yesterday. And there's just no recovery from yesterday doing so well. Who wants to go see a kind of like ridiculous concept of someone forgetting the Beatles and then remembering them and becoming a huge music star because it remembers this? It's a bizarre topic about music, but then you have a movie so close afterwards that seems somewhat similar, or someone's changing their life because of Bruce Springsteen's music. They're too similar. It's like the Armageddon sort of situation, Volcano, Dante's Peak stuff. Like, if something comes along and does quite well and connects with the audience, if something comes along just a little bit later and it feels the same, even if it's not the same in reality with the actual plot, but if the general public conceives of it to be very similar, they're not going to see it. because they have limited cash. So I think, unfortunately, that's what's happening here. It's a really good movie in a bad release slot at the worst possible timing to release it. And so maybe if they waited, if I was Warner Brothers after Yesterday was doing so well, I kind of would have pushed. I would think I would have wanted to push this out to like October, November. Give it some breathing room from Yesterday. Yesterday's still in the top 20. It's made $71 million domestically now. It got smothered by the success of that movie. Number 10 was Art of Racing in the Rain. 4.4 million, 45% drop this weekend, $1,600 per theater. It's going nowhere, essentially. $17 million total in its second weekend. Outside the top 10 was a wide release opener, Where'd You Go, Bernadette? The Richard Linklater new film from United Artists Releasing, which is kind of a joint venture between Annapurna and MGM. So obviously Annapurna's run out of money. I don't know how much they've marketed this film. I saw a couple of ads for it, but it's DOA. $3.4 million in 2,400 theaters. Per theater average on its opening weekend, $1,400. Disaster level. Now, they probably didn't spend $50 million to make this, but if they spent anything over $20 million, this is going to be a pretty big, massive flop, and some people are going to lose a lot of money here. What's to say about this one? I mean, who was the audience? You know, you look at this, Rotten Tomatoes score is 73%, 54 out of 100. And I think Deadpool kind of hits it on the head. Unless this movie's in the like high 80s, 90% in terms of Rotten Tomatoes, it's not going anywhere. So it wasn't good enough to get there. Verified audience score actually was high, 78%, 80 out of 100. That's a really solid score. The marketing budget wasn't there probably to reach the masses. All audience score 77%, 80 out of 100 as well. Cinema score B, which is not horrific for a movie like this, but for it to pop off, it needs to be B plus, A minus, A, or A plus, of course. So it didn't seem like it was just the quality was there, and I think Deadline kind of underlines that. Post track of a 70, which is pretty good. Letterboxd score 62. Linklater's last film, Last Flying Flag, got a 68, or sits at a 68 right now on Letterboxd. A simple favor, I thought, felt kind of similar to this in the vibe, to something kind of playful, colorful. That got a 66, so it's a little bit lower than that. Females showed up at 65%, way over indexed. Usually they're at 47% of the audience, 85% over 25. So it played very female, very over 25. This one, you know, I called this one being a flop the moment I saw the trailer. I believe it was a book, so maybe there's a book built-in audience here. But I think overall what's happening is this wasn't, and I'm going to say a product, it's not a marketable product. There is not an audience for this in the wide releases. If you're going to do a movie like this, to me, 10, 15 years ago, this is a 100% a platform release. And Deadline has a whole paragraph about you can't platform certain films. I get it, but then don't make the film, right? If you're making a film that has to be platformed to be successful, don't use that as an excuse to do a wide release, because it will fail, and this has completely failed. And everybody in the world could call it a failure 3-4 months ago. Like, it's so obvious that there's absolutely no wide release audience for this movie. So I don't know what they were thinking. I guess it's United Artists Releasing trying to, like, I don't know, save face. I mean, they already ruined Booksmart and Late Night, and they're releasing both of those movies are great movies, but they seem like failures because they're pushed out wide and nobody showed up. Well, no, why would somebody show up if they're not even aware of the movie's out? So it's just one of those situations where it doesn't, you know, maybe someone inside the business has a lot more perspective than I do about this, but like from someone who's watching this stuff and reading this stuff and seeing it, this one seemed like it was doomed for failure from the start. The moment the trailer was dropped, it was like, this isn't going to do well. So it's kind of bizarre to me that you would push it out to 2,400 theaters. The same that, you know, Warner Brothers pushed out Blinded by the Light, almost the same as like 47 meters. Like, this doesn't seem like these are the same type of products that you're doing a wide release on. I think it could have been successful in a platform release and a slow burn. Audiences seem to like it to some degree. You would just have to bide your time and wait on it for a long time, like a couple of months in limited release to get that word of mouth up. And maybe it never takes off. But then you don't spend $20 million to market it. So I don't know. It's a huge failure for what it is. It's a failure. I mean, it's a massive flop for what they attempted to do. It didn't have to be that way. It could have been a smaller film and made a couple $1 million, $4 million unlimited, $5 million, $7 million, and kind of done okay. Here it just seems like a pretty big failure. In any event, Where'd You Go, Bernadette will disappear by next week. Maybe it gets one more week in contract, probably for 24-minute theaters, but they could probably cut all these show times. Okay, so that is the top 10 and then some. Before we get to the Chris's Time Machine, let's talk a little bit about some limited releases. The Farewell is still doing quite well. It added 157 theaters. It's at basically 860 theaters right now. It sits at $12 million. I mean, just compare that to Where'd You Go, Bernadette? Where'd You Go, Bernadette sitting at $3.4 million right now. At best, it'll probably make $10 million. I think it could have made more money if they platformed released it. Or, you know what? They should have sold it to like HBO or Netflix, because that's what it feels like it is. And that way it could have an audience, it can engage that audience, and they can get really good money for it. The Farewells is a huge success for what it is. It's an A24 indie film about a Chinese family. Is that going to have a huge audience all across the United States? No. And they knew that, and they platform released it. And now it's dropping 28% week over week when it adds theaters. Now, the per theater average isn't great, $1,700, but it's in its sixth weekend now, and it's going to break $13 million. For a film like The Farewell, that is a big, big win. And it proves that the platform releasing strategy still works. So you got to wonder why these smaller films don't continue to take. It's like the old school route of doing it. Like, that's how every single indie film was released, 20 years ago. You would always platform it and test it out. In the case of The Farewell, it worked well. Maybe it wouldn't have worked with you. Where'd You Go, Bernadette? I don't know. Just throwing out that possibility. What else is out there? Anything else? Midsummer is still sticking around. $26 million. Hey, for what that movie was, that blows my mind they made that much money, because that's one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my life. I wonder if I don't see the Peanut Butter Falcon. Is that what the hell the movie's called? I don't see it, actually. Maybe they didn't report it in. I thought they were going to do a slow rollout on that one. Is there anything else that looks interesting? Unlimited, not so much. I think I was focused on Nightingales. Kind of not nothing's happening with that. Honeyland from Neon, that's not really going anywhere. It's at $200K right now. After the Wedding, I talked about last weekend, $160K right now. That's not going anywhere either. So there's not a ton on limited release that is doing well at all. Okay, so let's kick it over to Chris, who's going to talk to you about 1989 and what happened back then around this weekend, and then talk about 3 new films that are coming out. So here's Chris with the Wildline Time Machine.
Hey, thanks, Dan. This is Chris with the Wildline Time Machine. I'm not going to go with the time machine flourish every week, because I'd imagine it's going to get old quick. So let's just call it the Time Machine this week, shall we? What do I do on this segment of the Wildline? It's a new segment where I go through the past and future of the American box office. I'm going to shoot back to the past to look at an anniversary of a particular weekend that coincides with this weekend, and kind of compare that to what's going on nowadays in the box office, and then also shoot forward a little bit, either based on trailers that came out recently or movies that were recently greenlit or just went into production. I don't know, we'll kind of play it by ear week to week as I do this. Thanks for joining me. Let's start with the 30th anniversary of 1989 at the box office. We're looking specifically at the weekend of August 20th, 1989, in which the first week of release saw a easy number 1 grab, but not for a film that you'd expect to have easily grabbed the number 1 spot with its opening weekend, especially because this is a Thanksgiving movie that came out in the middle of August. Maybe it's part of that August dump that Dan has been talking about on the podcast recently. But nevertheless, it is kind of surprising that, yes, Uncle Buck, the John Candy movie that's semi-forgotten nowadays, managed to grab number 1 with only 8.8 at the box office for that weekend. That's unadjusted, but still enough to wrangle out that top spot from the previous week's opener, The Abyss, which actually dropped to number 3 in its second week. Kind of a strange weekend here in 1989. You still had a number of the summer hits out and still very strong in the top 10 to 15. You had Tim Burton's Batman, you had Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Lethal Weapon 2, Turner and Hooch, When Harry Met Sally, but you had Uncle Buck and The Abyss, as well as Parenthood in number 2, the Steve Martin family comedy that's semi-inspired, that recently finished a run of the Jason Katims show on not ABC, that was NBC, but definitely felt like an ABC show. Very strange top 3, right? You have The Abyss, which easily took it number 1 spot the week prior, but then here we are only a week later, it's already down to number 3. And actually, of all 3 of these films, Uncle Buck, Parenthood, and The Abyss, James Cameron's sci-fi fantasy that is kind of seen way more in a better light today than both Uncle Buck and Parenthood combined, is the biggest flop of them all. It only grabbed 7.2 mil at the box office that weekend, and then it wound up overall with only 54 million bucks. Kind of crazy to think about that because, at least from my own upbringing, that was kind of a good, not too scary, a PG-13 adventure sci-fi film that seemed iconic to me, but it was kind of a downer at the box office, especially after the hit of The Terminator just 5 years prior. So not sure how James Cameron wrangled himself out of that one. I mean, it's not a huge flop, but still it's not exactly what you'd want from the guy who created Terminator and, of course, Titanic and Avatar. Nevertheless, it was not so much of a failure because obviously he reclaimed his kind of 90s glory just a couple years later with Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Parenthood, number 2 on that weekend box office with 7.6 million unadjusted. It was a movie that somehow cracked the 100 million mark. This is insane to me. This is it's a Ron Howard film, I suppose, and Randy Newman composed the music. It's a quintessential late 80s movie, I think. You've got a young Joaquin Phoenix and Keanu Reeves in there as well, but this is not a film that I think has necessarily aged all that great. It's definitely not a film that people talk about anymore. It's, part of that Brian Grazer produced kind of glut of family films that kind of got lost to time. I remember when the news came out that Jason Katims was developing a show for NBC after his hugely important, maybe not successful, but definitely had a cult following, his Friday Night Lights series, also based off of a film. It was such a weird kind of left field choice for the next movie to be turned into a TV series. I don't know. I don't remember it all too fondly, but apparently it struck a chord with middle America, perhaps, and it's just not the kind of movie you'd see nowadays in the box office, right? I don't even know if they really make these for streaming anymore. It seems like family stories are relegated either to like the indie art house, like The Farewell, or perhaps like more just evident on television. I don't know. It's a strange little story from 1989 that Universal's Parenthood broke that 100 million mark. Number 3, like I said, The Abyss, and number 1, Uncle Buck. I just want to mention a little bit more about that one. Of course, John Hughes, kind of reliable, is in his waning days in the 1980s, wrote and directed this one. It's not seen as one of his big pictures, especially because it did not focus on adolescence. It had, Macaulay Culkin, and it paved the way for the next year's Home Alone. But other than that, it just seemed like a very kind of, once again, standard family comedy. I remember it fondly, definitely more fondly than Parenthood, but I think that's, kind of the larger-than-life presence that John Candy brought to the screen. He was kind of a reliable, modest hit kind of guy. It ended up making 66, almost 67 mil at the box office that year, and so, it's once again, not a huge hit, not as big of a hit as Parenthood, but definitely, respectable. That seems to be more in line with what I'd expect, like a breakout family comedy to make nowadays. But as we saw, Dan was hoping that movies like Fighting With My Family would become breakout hits, but I just don't think there's a space for that in the movie theater anymore. It's all about sci-fi and adventure and blockbuster and, total carnage of the earth and what have you. So, strange stuff, 1989, 30 years is actually a long time ago, so I'm not too worried about it comparing it to nowadays. But still, it's like, I don't know, you'd think that there'd be some kind of through line. I guess it's with The Abyss, but definitely a lot louder, a lot less nuanced than that, as of course we saw James Cameron started opting for the opposite of nuance as he headed into the 90s and started making 200 plus million movies. Okay, so let's take a look at the future now. Dan's going to do a fall preview soon, so I'm not trying to step on his toes too much. I'm going to look at a few movies whose trailers came out this week to try to prognosticate exactly what they're going to look like at the box office later this year. So jumping all the way ahead to November for the first one, it is the first, I think, Christmas movie coming out of the season for 2019, and it's a rom-com that is kind of looks super traditional. It's interesting because it's co-written by Emma Thompson, who also plays a supporting role in the film, and it's directed by Paul Feig, who was known to kind of resuscitate the rom-com genre with Bridesmaids, though that seemed to play more as a straight kind of friends comedy, but there's still rom-com elements to it. He also had a huge hit with The Heat a couple of years later, though that movie seems to have kind of fallen off most people's memory, even though it made tons of money, over $150 million that year. But then, of course, he definitely fell underwater a little bit with the notorious Ghostbusters reboot of 2016. So he's been kind of trying to crawl himself out of the doghouse, so to speak, for the past few years. He seems to be banking on this. It does not have like the crudeness of The Heat or Bridesmaids. It does try to trade in more of the sweetness and more of the wholesomeness, and also features one of the actors from the breakout 2018 romantic comedy Crazy Rich Asians. That's Henry Golding in the co-lead role for Last Christmas, coming out this November, whose trailer just dropped this week. Is a big deal because people have been waiting for Emilia Clarke from Game of Thrones, Daenerys, to finally make her star-making turn after the series ended. I don't know if this is going to be it for her. She doesn't look super unique or interesting in it. Speaking of last week's podcast, when I mentioned Rachel McAdams, she kind of looks like a Rachel McAdams stand-in, so to speak. She plays a Christmas shop worker who bumps into Henry Golding on the streets. A very, stereotypical meet cute, but then there's some kind of weirdness going on between, why she keeps bumping into him, and like they never trade phone numbers or something. There's a whole Twitter thread about how the trailer gives away the twist, and I don't want to get into that, but it does seem kind of hackneyed and not really all that special, though there is definitely, like, Henry Golding, he commands the presence of that camera, and I think he's just eminently watchable. So I think that there's some, Paul Feig knows what he's doing. He's kind of a craftsman when it comes to like traditional, but then also like kind of going outside the edges, but he doesn't seem to be coloring outside the lines too much here. We shall see if this turns out to be a hit, but a lot of people on the internet are talking about it this week with the trailer that dropped. I think people are kind of clamoring for some trad rom-com. Netflix gave it to us earlier this summer with Always Be My Maybe, but is it a cash cow at the box office? I don't think so, really. Like, we haven't had a hugely successful rom-com since I want to say like Silver Linings Playbook back in 2012. It looks like that's the biggest rom-com on the list I'm looking at from Box Office Mojo of romantic comedies over the past 20 years. Like that's the 13th most successful rom-com. Otherwise, Crazy Rich Asians is the only other one since before 2010. That's kind of nuts. Like, only 200 plus mil rom-coms in this decade, so I don't see this being too big. I would maybe expect a domestic gross final number around 50 or 60 seems to be more reasonable for something like this. Maybe that's enough to justify it. We'll see. The other movie that had a trailer come out this week that I am super stoked about, but is not in terms of like becoming a blockbuster hit, just in terms of becoming an art house hit, is Terrence Malick's new film, A Hidden Life. I don't think it's going to be even that huge for box office numbers for an indie art house film, but it could kind of resuscitate Terrence Malick's career, and I think Dan would co-sign this with me, because this trailer looks like he's not only in his wheelhouse, but he's also trying to actually have an audience for his films now. He's not just kind of indulging his most personal visions like he has been with Song to Song, Knight of Cups recently, which just kind of played as like watercolor dreamscapes with romance and Blades of Grass and what have you. The Tree of Life was kind of his last big picture, still indie art house, but it made 13 mil, which is better than 2005's The New World did, his Pocahontas, John Smith retelling. Of course, the biggest movie he's ever had at the box office is The Thin Red Line back in 1998, made over 36 mil, helped that it had some Oscar buzz, but of course it was also undercut by coming out the same year as Saving Private Ryan, the other World War II film. The thing that makes me excited about The Hidden Life is it's also a World War II film, but it's not a war movie. It's not soldiers involved. It's about kind of this resistance effort of this small community that seems to be starting to get overrun by Nazis in the early days of World War II, which is a very interesting way to kind of make it a World War II movie without actually making it like the stereotypical, prototypical, soldiers on the front lines kind of thing. I think Dunkirk was perhaps kind of the last big hurrah for that genre, at least for a few years. So I think it's going to not only have a new twist on a familiar genre, but it seems very relevant and allegorical to what's going on today. So I think if he can get that critical buzz going, that it could be kind of a breakout, maybe his biggest hit since Thin Red Line. I don't know, here's hoping. The last movie I want to talk about with you today also had its trailer come out this week, and it's coming out on Christmas Day. Hidden Life, by the way, comes out limited December 13th, just in time for awards season to ramp up, which I think is a perfect spot. Let it come out a couple weeks before Christmas, and then maybe expand it wide in January once the nominations come out. The last movie comes out on Christmas Day, and it's probably the most talked about trailer this week. It just came out, and people have been waiting for it. Greta Gerwig's remake of Little Women. Yes, it is the fourth iteration of this classic story, but it honestly looks like the most interesting. Like, it's Greta Gerwig. She has known how to thread that very tricky needle of intense seriousness as well as light comedy, and obviously she hit it out of the park with Lady Bird a couple years ago, and I think she's going to do it again with this one. Obviously it kind of feels strange having it be an old clothes movie, as I like to call them, but between the cast and the dialogue, co-written by Sarah Polley, who is also a critical darling, and then Saoirse Ronan, Emma Watson, Meryl Streep in the cast, and Florence Pugh from Midsommar, who I think gave one of the best performances of the year. This is exactly what everybody wants, I think, at the end of this year. I think it's an escape, but it's also a reality. This is probably the first, of the new wave of feminism to get a chance at taking Little Women to the screen, and there's lots on the trailer anyway, seems to be a lot of emphasis on that aspect of it rather than just the romance story or just the family story. So I think I was skeptical at first that Greta Gerwig would go to adapt something, but here she is, just proving me wrong that she can do that and still make it a quintessential kind of quirky movie that could also just be a huge crossover hit. I don't know. I'm liking a lot for this. This movie I think could make upwards of 80 or 90 mil if it played its cards right. Depends on the rest of how the marketing goes, of course, and how Oscar season goes. But yeah, this is huge. Thanks so much, Dan, for having me back on the podcast again. This has been the Wildline Time Machine. I'm Chris. I'll be back next week with some more talk about the past and future of the American box office.
Okay, that was a great segment from Chris there. Talk to you a little bit about Uncle Buck, which is a great movie. I love Uncle Buck. I think it's like John Hughes and John Candy's one of their unheralded classics. Now, it's not Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, but it's certainly one of the more entertaining and fascinating films they did together. The new films they talked about, I think, are fantastic ones to look at. Little Women, I think, is going to be massive this holiday season. I mean, it just has all the elements that you want a film to do. So much buzz already, especially the under 25 crowd is going to show up to that like no other. Hidden Life, look, I'm a Terrence Malick stan. For anything he's done, The New World and before, anything after that, I'm not a huge fan of, actually. Like, I hated Tree of Life. But I think this new one looks fantastic. Last Christmas, I don't know. I watched the trailer on that one. I was listening to Chris's segment there. I don't know. Like, I just don't. This seems kind of like a meh film. I don't think it's going to do all that well. But exciting stuff and a really good sort of walkthrough from Chris about the past and future of the box office. Let's close this show out, folks. So let's talk about what's going to happen at the end of the summer here in the last couple of weeks. The finish line of summer 2019. We have Ready or Not coming out this Wednesday, the 21st. I don't know. I thought it was going to do okay when I saw the trailer. The trailer was great. It looks like a really interesting concept. It's obviously a play on The Most Dangerous Game. Weird stuff happened with the shooting in El Paso, and they canceled the Blumhouse version of this called The Hunt. people hunting each other. Apparently it's political. I don't know. They canceled the release of the film, which I thought was so stupid and kind of pathetic, to be honest with you. And so Ready or Not has a free runway here. But who's going to show up to see this? I mean, college students aren't going to show up to see it because they're busy, like, reading over their syllabi. It's not really for teenagers all that much because it is rated R. Younger folks, they're going to show up for this on a Wednesday? No. So I don't see who the audience is going to show up for this. I could be wrong, though. It could break out. But we had 47 meters. If you want to see a horror film, I already saw my horror film for the next 2 weeks. I've seen my horror film until it 2 comes out. So I just don't think it's going to do very well. On the 23rd, we have Angel Has Fallen. That looks really fun. Gerard Butler action movies are so over the top and ridiculous, but they are entertaining. I think that one might do okay. It's on probably the second quietest weekend of the year. The weekend of the 30th will probably be the quietest weekend of the year. So we'll see how that one does from Lionsgate. Don't Let Go is on the 30th. I don't really know anything about that. It's from a smaller distributor, so I don't think it's going to do anything. And then we hit It, and then we're in sort of autumn. What is It going to do? It's going to be a really big discussion for the next couple of weeks because I have no idea. Chris is thinking it's going to make tons of cash, and it might do that. And if you go by history and data, it looks like it's going to be huge and massive, well over $100 million opening. There's just a part of me that just feels like the hype is not the same level, but I don't really know a lot of people under the age of 25. So my barometer is a little bit off. So I do think it's going to do well. I question a little bit. Usually with the sequel, it pops off and makes more than the original on opening weekend. I'm not sure about this one. So we'll see about that. And that's the start of autumn. In September, then we have Goldfinch, we have Hustlers. On the 20th, we have Ad Astra, Rainbow Last Blood. That's going to be an interesting one. I think Ad Astra is going to be a fascinating opening. I think it flops. What else is coming out? It's in October with War. I don't know that one really well. Joker, I'm dreading that release. Just dreading it. There's just some really bad vibes about that film, and like the view of it. Todd Phillips, he's a good director. It just seems like the wrong film at the wrong time to release. It might make a lot of money, but I just don't think it's going to make anybody feel good. The Woman in the Window, that looks kind of fun. That's also on the 4th. Gemini Man might be big on the 11th. Addams Family on the 11th. Genix on the 11th. I don't know that one at all. Zombieland 2, Black and Blue on the 25th countdown. Last Full Measure. This kind of feels like I'm gonna do a fall preview here in the next couple of weeks. Kind of feels like a quiet fall to me. I think the holiday season is gonna be ridiculous. There's so much crazy stuff coming out over the holidays, like Terminator, Midway's coming out, Doctor Sleep's coming out, Charlie's Angels, Ford versus Ferrari. November is stacked. I'm looking at it right now. It's insane how stacked November is. Knives Out looks fantastic. I think September and October are pretty quiet. In any event, thanks for listening, folks. I will be back next week. This has been the Wildline Podcast.